Sewing on a button is a way to manage your clothing, or a way to keep it in good condition so you're able to use it for a long time. By being able to sew on your own buttons, you're able to do it quick and easy without having to send it out for someone else to do it. It's simple, it's fast, and it helps you to be able to keep your favorite pieces of clothing just as you got them. The first thing you need to know about buttons is that there are a lot of different types. You might pick to use one type of button over another based on the style of your clothing, the color of your clothing, or the kind of design that you want to make. You might pick one button that might be a little bit more fun, have an interesting design, or match the rest of the buttons that are already on the piece of clothing. It's up to you. It's a great way to add some style to a garment and to add your own individual flair. We categorize buttons by the amount of holes that they have. The first type of button is called a two-hole button because it has two holes. You see that they come in lots of different shapes and colors. That's also true for the next type of button. These are called four-hole buttons because they have, you guessed it, 4 holes. It's a little bit stronger because the more sets of holes, the more thread that goes through, and the stronger your final product will be. They'll hold on nice and tight. They have an extra set of holes. Our last type of button is called a shank button. This type of button has 1 hole. It's called a shank button because it has a small piece of metal or wire, or sometimes plastic, that's where the thread will go through and attach the button to the piece of clothing. The first thing you'll need to do when you're ready to sew on a button is to get your supplies together. Of course, you'll need the button that you've picked. You'll also need a pair of sewing shears to cut your threads, a spool of thread, usually in the color of the button or a color that will match your piece of clothing. Today I'm going to show you with lime green because it will stand out better against the button that I've picked. It'll be easier to see how the thread weaves through. You'll also need a piece of fabric or the clothing that your button's going to go on, as well as a hand sewing needle and a straight pin. Now that I have all my supplies together, I'm ready to thread my needle. I'm going to use an arm's length of thread. Remember, that's the distance from the top of your shoulder to the end of your fingertips. That will give me a nice manageable amount of thread that will be easy to pull in and out of the buttonholes and through the fabric. Once my thread is through the eye of my needle, I'm going to need to double the thread. That means to bring the 2 pieces together and bring the ends so they match. I'll make the 2 ends come together and I'll tie my knot so the 2 pieces are knotted as one. By having a doubled thread, I have a stronger thread to go through my button, and therefore a button that's much more secure. It'll hold on to your piece of clothing much stronger. So I have everything I need and I'm ready to start to sew my button. You'll notice here that I'm using a thicker thread today. This is our 6th grade thread, and I'm doing that because it's thicker so it will be easier for you to see as I come up and down between the sets of holes. When you sew your button, you'll be using thinner thread, our 7th grade thread, and you'll want to use a color that matches the color of the button that you're using. Today I'll be sewing a 4-hole button. And that's because once you know how to sew on a 4-hole button, a 2-hole button will be even simpler. When you sew a 4-hole button, you have 2 options in terms of the way that you come up and down between each set of holes. One way is to go diagonally between each set of holes to create an X shape. You could also come up and down in parallel lines between each set of holes. The difference here is mainly in style. It's up to you to change what you want to do based on the design that you want on your piece of clothing. What you don't want when you sew a 4-hole button is to come in a shape that creates a box. We don't do that because this is actually less secure. There's too much thread, it's too tight, and it's actually more likely to come off of your piece of clothing. I'll be sewing my button onto a piece of fabric, a fabric square today, and I'm doing that so it will be easier for you to see. First, I need to mark where I want my button to go, and I want it right in the center of this fabric square, so I can use a pencil or a piece of marking chalk to mark just where that button is going to go. You can make just a small dot to show you where the button will be. If I were sewing the button onto a piece of clothing, such as a shirt like this, I could do the same thing. Mark with pencil or chalk just where the button's going to go, evenly spaced between the existing buttons where it needs to be. This dot won't show because the button will be covering it, so the mark is just for you to help you out while you're sewing it on. So this dot represents where my button is going to go. So now I need to put the button on top of my fabric square, and I need to come up from the back of the fabric right at that dot. And I come up from the back because then my knot at the end of this thread will be on the back of the fabric where it won't be visible. Knots aren't that pretty, so we want them to be hidden. So we come up from the back of the fabric, and I can actually even see right through to that dot that I made, that's there on the other side. You'll poke through and make sure you're coming up right at that mark that you made. Then you can slip it through one of the holes in your button. I've come up in the top left hole, so now I'm going to need to come down in the bottom left hole. You want to use a straight pin when you're going up and down between the sets of holes, and with a straight pin serves the purpose of keeping the thread a little bit loose when you sew the button down. Now, loose thread is actually a little bit of a good thing. We want it to be tight and secure, but we don't want it to be so tight that it's really, really taut, or really, really almost too tight. Too tight meaning that it would be less secure and very likely to pop off. So, I hold my straight pin down with one hand, and the needle is in my other hand. I'm going to come down over that straight pin into the bottom left hole. I come up from the back, in the top hole, and down through the front in the bottom hole. That pin gives me a little bit of slack, which is what I want so my button won't be too tight and too taut that it could come off. At this point, the button or the straight pin has served its purpose. I can take it away so it will be a little bit easier to hold. When you're sewing on your button, you want to remember a countdown from 5, or 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The 5 is the step that I'm doing right now. That refers to the amount of times that you come up within each set of holes. So I've already done 2. So this is the third time. And 5. So that's my first set of parallel lines. Now I need to come up through these holes on the right, and I'll repeat the same process 5 times up and down through this set of holes. And here is number 5. Okay, so my needle comes out through that bottom hole, and now I'm on the back part of my fabric. So now, remember that we have a countdown from 5. The 5 is the amount of times through each set of holes. Our step number 4 refers to the amount of times that we wrap our thread around the back of our button. In order to be able to do that, I need to have my needle coming up between this fabric and the button. So I will poke up in between the fabric and the button, so it's kind of in between those 2 layers. See how it's coming out here? Between the fabric and the button. And we need to wrap it around the base of the button 4 times. What this does is create a shank, and the shank serves 2 purposes. First of all, it makes the buttons more securely sewn. Second of all, it also gives a little bit of lift to the button. It takes it up off just a little bit off of this fabric so you have room to button the button when it's on a piece of clothing. Let me show you what I mean. On the shirt that I have here, it has a shank, which gives it a little bit of room to be able to fit through the buttonhole and have this piece of fabric right here have room to rest. So here's how we create our shank. We'll wrap our thread 4 times around the base of the button. 1, 2, 3, 4. And this is what our shank looks like. It looks like a ring of fabric, a ring of thread, right around the base of our button. It's nice and tight, and it makes our button more secure. Now I need to come back to the back part of my button to secure the button to the back side of fabric. My first stitch has secured it to the front, and this step will secure it to the back. So I poke to the back of my fabric again to come out on the back side. So countdown step number 3 refers to 3 securing stitches, just going in and out of the fabric on the back side. When you do this step, when you take your securing stitches, they should be right on top of these existing stitches. They should not be anywhere around the button except right on top of here. We want our stitches to be neat, we want them to be on top of each other, and we don't want to have any stray stitching around. So 3 securing stitches just like this. Take up a little bit of the fabric, in, out, pull. That is number 1. In, out, pull. There is number 2. And on number 3, we're going to get ready to move on to step number 2, or 2 tying knots, 2 securing knots. So, the knots that we make will be done exactly the same way as you know from 6th grade when you did the line or blanket stitch. All you do is take up a little bit of the fabric, and the thread will create a loop right here. You'll take your needle through that loop and pull to create a knot. We do that twice, so it's doubly secure. Take a small stitch, pull through the needle through the loop, and pull tightly. Now, step number 1, the last step coming backwards, is to trim your loose threads with one little cut. At this point, you should also trim any other loose threads so your button is nice and neatly sewn. Here you have your neatly sewn button. So let's just review our steps. You're going to go up and down 5 times between each set of holes. Then, with your needle coming out between the fabric and the button, you're going to wrap your thread around 4 times to create a securing shank. That's this part right here. Your needle will come around back to the back of the fabric. You'll take 3 in-out securing stitches. You'll tie a knot 2 times for extra security, and you'll cut those threads once. So that was my 4-hole button. If I do a 2-hole button like this, I only have to go up and down between this one set of holes. There you have your securely sewn button.